Till now, we have traced the background of the non-aligned movement, understood the meaning and origin of non-alignment, and now we will be looking at the various factors responsible for the rise of the non-aligned movement. Now, we have seen some of such factors in a very brief manner while looking at the background behind the rise of the non-aligned movement. Let's now look at these factors in detail. The first factor we will be looking at is the growth of nationalism. Now, we have seen nationalism coming up in various topics. We also saw how nationalism, or in particular aggressive nationalism, led to two world wars and also the rise of totalitarian ideologies between those two world wars. But in this case, the rise of nationalism is a positive concept, and we will see how that works. So we saw that at the end of the Second World War, majority of the world was still under the control of European powers. So most of the world was still colonies of major European nations. This led to the independence struggle of these nations. So therefore we see that freedom movements rose up in Asia and Africa. And these freedom movements were characterized by the growth of nationalism. As these freedom movements realized their strength lies in nationalism, and along with that also a heightened anti-colonial sentiment. Now we will be seeing what this form of nationalism actually is. Over here we can see some instances of various kinds of freedom movements taking place in Asia and Africa. But this nationalism we are talking about, which rose up in Africa and Asia, was primarily an anti-colonial reaction. This was more of a binding force, a way to get many voices of an emerging nation together so that they can fight against the external influences or to drive out outsiders and to therefore protect and strengthen their sovereignty. This is different from the Western concept of nationalism. As in the West and Europe in particular, nationalism refers to the ethnic or linguistic superiority, or a sentiment through which one showcases the superiority of their ethnicity or language. This was not the case of Eastern nationalism, or the nationalism that grew up in the East as a form of anti-colonial reaction. This nationalism was primarily a way to settle all differences and to make sure everyone comes together to fight for independence. And that was the primary characteristic of this form of nationalism which grew up. The reason why it was positive in nature. So while the East inherited the concept of nationalism from the West, they modified it accordingly. Now, this anti-colonial nationalism of the Asian and African colonies fighting for their independence was found on the principles of the creation of nation states alongside national self-determination. Now, national self-determination refers to a concept where the people of a nation are responsible for electing their own representatives alongside also deciding what the policy of their government would be. A state that follows national self-determination cannot be considered as a dependency of any other external power. Therefore, these were the principles on which such nationalism was built, and also such nationalism became the spearhead behind their independence struggles. And thus these colonies kept on fighting for their independence. The Second World War and the end of it also opened their eyes in many ways, as the myth of European superiority and European invincibility shattered, as the people in the colonies saw how an Asian power, Japan, was able to inflict many defeats on USA, Britain and Russia, and also how invincible European superpowers such as the erstwhile Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire disappeared into thin air. Not only that, the mighty British Empire itself also faced many losses. Thus, the people in the colonies realized that if they continue on their path of fighting for independence based on their anti-colonial nationalism, they will succeed. And that they did. Finally, these nations were able to achieve independence. Now, we know that India achieved independence on 15th August 1947 after 2 centuries of colonial subjugation. But India was not the only nation around this time which got independence. In fact, in the period between 1945 and 1960, 3 dozen Asian and African colonies were able to secure independence for themselves. Therefore, this period is often referred to as decolonization, or the opposite of colonization. So we understand that such nationalism led to a period of decolonization where these erstwhile colonies were able to secure independence and therefore emerge as new nation states. Now, once they achieved their independence, these nations knew one thing for sure, that never again were they letting any other external power control their hard-earned sovereignty. Therefore, they focused on policies of national development, national interest, and regional cooperation, as they realized that only when they are united are they strong. But this period of decolonization coincided with the Cold War itself, and in the Cold War situation there was a rise of the spheres of influence of the two superpowers, in which these newly independent nations found themselves to be in a dilemma. These superpowers considered these newly independent decolonized nations as easy targets for making them join their spheres of influence. However, these newly independent nations wanted to preserve their sovereignty and therefore stay distant from such sphere of influences and bloc politics of the Cold War. Now, they wanted to stay neutral, but at the same time also wanted to be active in the international sphere. In this condition, they understood that they need a proper policy through which not only would they be able to safeguard their hard-earned sovereignty, stay distant from the Cold War bloc politics, but also be involved in the international sphere. And the answer to this was in following the policy of non-alignment. This is how non-alignment became a core part of these nations' own policies, and the non-alignment movement grew up around it. Now let's look at the next factor behind the rise of non-aligned movement, which is anti-colonialism. Now, these newly independent nations of Asia and Africa had strong anti-colonialist tendencies and sentiments, and this sentiment was looming as they continued on their path of development. Not only was this anti-colonialism reserved towards the colonial subjugation they faced at the hands of the archaic empires, but at the same time this also referred to a new tendency, which was neo-colonialism. Now, this rose up in the Cold War period, which was a method of indirectly influencing and therefore overpowering developing nations, particularly by the superpowers, which are USA and USSR. We remember how they were expanding their spheres of influence, and as they went on with this expansion through military alliances as well as economic partnerships, they soon were able to overpower such weak nations and therefore make them into their neo-colonies. These newly independent nations were aware of such neo-colonialist tendencies, and therefore they wanted to stay away from it and also put up a resistance against it, and therefore adopt an independent path. These newly independent nations also wanted to help other colonized countries and regions to finally gain their own independence, and therefore they wanted to form a platform for anti-colonialism, and out of which emerged a non-aligned movement. The next factor we will be looking at is underdevelopment and economic aid, and how that led to the rise of the non-aligned movement. We can see over here a satirical depiction of a major world power giving aid to various underdeveloped nations and doing it as a sense of charity. We will see more into the true nature of these forms of aid as we understand this factor better. Did you know that India in the ancient times had a nickname of its own? That nickname was a golden bird. What was the reason why India was referred to as a golden bird? This is because India used to be a wealthy and prosperous region. At least it was until the colonial powers came to our shores. When Britain was able to establish its control over India, they started a system called drain of wealth, through which they were able to exploit and then send back the riches of India to Britain, which would then fund the industrialization of Britain. This wealth included the riches of the local rulers, our agricultural products, our minerals, as well as the revenue we paid for our own lands. Now, can you imagine that a poor man who was working hard on his fields in a remote village in Bihar was actually helping a rich industrialist in London buy better machines for his factory? So we understand that colonial rule was nothing but mindless plunder. In fact, we can understand this reign of wealth very clearly, as before the British came to India, India accounted for 40% of the entire world's wealth. However, when the British left India, India only accounted for 2% of it. So isn't this mindless plunder? Now, this was not only restricted to India, Africa and African colonies had it much worse. So therefore, it won't be a big stretch to say that when these colonies were finally able to establish themselves as nations, centuries of colonial rule and exploitation left these newly formed nations of Asia and Africa underdeveloped and also in extreme poverty. But then again, these nations now finally had a chance, as they were now in control of their country's economies and also their sovereignty. And therefore, after attaining independence, they started a program of economic reconstruction. These nations were keen to improve the standards of living of their people and also develop their country systematically so that they can find a place in the global economy. But they realize that they need help for this. Now, who were to help these newly independent nations? Both the blocs of the Cold War, one led by USA and the other led by USSR, pledged to assist these nations economically as well as technically. But there was a clause. These nations had to first join their blocs. Now, these newly independent nations were not happy with this clause, as they had to sacrifice their sovereignty just in order to get such economic assistance as well as technical guidance. Also, they realized that help from only one bloc would not be enough for the deplorable condition, and also how much can a single bloc or a nation do. At the same time, if these nations ally with a single bloc, they would not be able to have any economic relations or get assistance from such strategic nations which might be in the other bloc. Take the case of India, for example. If India would have joined the capitalist bloc led by USA, of course it would have got access to aid from USA, but it would have had to miss out on trade relations with China and the Soviet Union, which are geographically much closer to India. Now, if India would have joined the Soviet bloc, it would have got aid in the form of foodstuffs, but it would have had to lose out on such technical assistance as well as modern machineries which the capitalist bloc gave to its members. So just like India, many other decolonized and underdeveloped nations face the same dilemma. Now, in this situation, these nations felt that they should be following a policy of non-alignment, a situation where they do not directly ally with any of the blocs, but appease both of them in order to get economic assistance from both these blocs, which would in turn help them achieve their goals at a much faster rate. These newly independent nations also realize a very core psychology of the Western nations, the fact that they have a savior complex. Now, what is this savior complex? Western nations like to help weak countries and then show off such contribution in international platforms as a symbol of their greatness. Therefore, if a country is able to get aid and assistance from both the blocs, and these blocs would in turn compete amongst themselves to show off who can help these countries better, and in turn it would help the underdeveloped countries itself. Therefore, it was realized that following a policy of non-alignment was also economically sustainable for these newly independent and underdeveloped nations. When the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was asked what he feels about the Indians, he commented that they are a beastly class of people with a beastly religion. Now, while that is a horrible thing to say, that is not the worst thing a colonial power has said about us. In fact, colonial rule was so harsh that often was the case when Indians were reduced to the position of dogs. South African cities used to segregate their own majority population, the Africans, into separate communities, and if a native person accidentally enters the property of a colonizer, then his life is no longer his own property. Now, this particular condition stemmed out of a systematic racism on the part of the colonial powers. Now, racism refers to a tendency of considering someone else's ethnicity or race as inferior. This soon becomes racialism, which is outright hatred for someone else's race or ethnicity. We have seen instances of how racialism can go wrong when we saw how Hitler's racialism caused the Second World War. But if truth be told, racism has never been as systematic and prolonged as was the case during the times of colonization. When the colonial powers started to colonize Africa and Asia, they justified it on the grounds that the natives living in these regions are racially inferior to them, have a backward culture, and therefore were destined to be ruled by them, a much more superior power. This ethical justification of colonial rule is often called the white man's burden, as if these white men were taking so much pain to bring cultural advancement and civilization to the other regions of the world. What this attitude led was centuries of racial subjugation of the natives of the colonies, where their language, culture, eating habits, religion, and festivals all were considered to be barbaric and uncivilized and therefore were repressed. People from these races were often dehumanized, treated like animals, and made to do menial tasks. This was the attitude in which generations of natives grew up in across different colonies. When these people were finally able to secure their independence, they still were left with the horrors of centuries of racial hatred towards them. They finally had control over the nation and they wanted no such instance ever again. They all felt very sympathetic towards each other. After all, they faced similar subjugation, and that made them come together and organize themselves as a movement. In fact, the mutual sympathy which these nations felt merged with the shared experiences of economic exploitation and political domination which was inflicted on them when they were colonies. This made them realize that all of them are actually very similar, and only when they are united can they be strong. And this led them to cooperate with each other for mutual development, keeping aside their geographical and cultural differences, and to also create a movement around such cooperation. So therefore, any form of geographical and cultural differences that these former colonies had was completely trumped out by the shared experiences and the shared trauma they had of being colonized. And this particular shared trauma and shared experiences made them come together and then cooperate to form a movement of its own. These nations therefore felt the need for a movement which will unite them and act as a platform to end racial hatred and any other forms of cultural subjugation. And therefore, out of this cooperation emerged the non-aligned movement. The Second World War ended when USA dropped 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, while this ended the war, what it truly did is change the conception of world peace forever. The world was alarmed at the destruction and also the loss of life which is caused by the single push of a button, and this made them urge for world peace. In fact, they realized that destruction which would have taken multiple wars to cause can now be simply caused by the split second of a decision. This was the condition which the newly independent nations found themselves in, and this helped them shape their idea of peace and also made them pledge for the need for peace. In fact, as an aftermath of the Second World War, there was an overall aversion for war itself, and this was particularly felt in these newly independent nations. They urged for the establishment of peace and also for pursuing development not through war but through peaceful means and also through peaceful coexistence, as they understood that any development that is done through war would not be development, as modern warfare has no victors, as everybody loses something or the other in the enormous devastation caused by such wars. And therefore, in order to promote peace as well as development, these nations decided to come together and to form a movement around such cooperation which would not only help for the establishment of international peace but would also help strengthen the cause and the functions of the United Nations organization. This movement was of course the non-aligned movement. Now, we already saw what the Cold War period was all about. This period was marked by a remarkable escalation of global tension. Now, it's difficult to explain such global tension in the form of a lecture, In fact, such global tension was also difficult to comprehend for the people who were living at the time of the Cold War, as there was no real war as such, because these two superpowers were engaged in a form of ideological conflict. But then there were some escalations where everyone thought that the war would now break out, and this would be no other war, as this would become a nuclear war which would annihilate entire humanity. So imagine living with this tension every single day, and while no real war goes out around you, that day very well might be your last. That is the level of tension which was there in the Cold War period. And this was very counterproductive for development of newly independent nations. And therefore, these nations felt it was better to maintain distance from both the superpowers and their blocs, and to also make a statement of their distance. But a simple statement is not enough, as it might be interpreted as being isolationist or being anti-internationalist. These nations wanted to be present in the international sphere, but also wanted to be distant from the Cold War politics. And therefore they realized that they need a proper statement of their non-involvement, which would not be interpreted as being isolationist or being anti-internationalist. So it was non-involvement which was their stance during the Cold War period. Can we answer this question now? What was the stance taken by the newly independent nations during the Cold War? Was it anti-internationalism, non-involvement, isolationism, or aggressive militantism? The correct answer is non-involvement. Now, the non-aligned movement presented itself as the perfect means to properly make their statement of non-involvement in the Cold War politics, and therefore it would help those nations who do not wish to participate in the Cold War blocs, but still they could be internationally involved and also could be vocal against such spheres of influences and the Cold War bloc politics. Therefore, it was understood that for those nations who wanted to be present in the international sphere but also safeguard their own sovereignty and be distant from the Cold War bloc politics, non-alignment was the perfect option for them. And therefore this factor not only led to the rise of non-alignment, it also helped its popularity. So in this lesson we saw the various factors which were responsible for the rise of the non-aligned movement. In the subsequent lesson we would be looking at the growth of the movement in detail. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.